Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are.
hey, Molly.
Are you, Molly? Are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to Balkan Circle. My name is Mary Newberger. I'm a professor of history here at UT Austin and also the director for the Center of Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Kirill, why don't you? Kirill's my co-host. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
My name is Kirill Avramov, and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies, and I'm also the director of the Global Disinformation Lab, which is housed in our department, and I'm a proud co-host of Mary of Balkan Circle, which again has allowed for everyone to participate, learn new things, and discuss exciting books, ideas, and talk about Balkans.
So I'm excited today to introduce our speaker. Her name is Emanuela Grama, and she's an associate professor in the Department of History at Carnegie Mellon University. She received her PhD from the Interdisciplinary Program in Anthropology and History at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And she's the recipient of numerous fellowships from the Werner Gren Foundation, the American Council for Learned Societies, the Max Weber Postdoctoral Program of European University Institute in Florence, Italy. She has conducted extensive archival and ethnographic research in different locations in Romania, and she specializes in the history of 20th century Central and Eastern Europe with a focus on urban politics, processes of state making, property, memory, and cultural change in 20th and 21st century Romania. Her book, which came out in 2019, is called Socialist Heritage, The Politics of Past and Place in Romania, which was the winner of the ACES 2020 Ed Hewett Book Prize. So we're excited to hear your talk today, Emma. You can go ahead and share screen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, first of all, to Mary, Kirill, Stephen, and everyone putting together this wonderful series of talks, which have been really a wonderful source of inspiration and academic joy, if I may put these two things together, especially during the pandemic. And I really appreciate your decision of keeping this on Zoom so that many more people could attend and really learn so much. So thank you so much for creating this vibrant virtual community. I am going to start sharing the screen. The talk today will be a book talk, but I will not, so let me actually. Okay,
Do you need any assistance, Hannah?
Yeah, I think that should be it. Okay,
Fantastic.
All right.
Yes, it's visible.
Visible, perfect. All right, so this is the book cover. I know there is an overlap with the background, it's the same photo. I wanted to start with the cover because the cover is really, to a certain extent, visual representations of some of the questions and concepts and themes informing the research and arguments of the book. So if you, I'm going to really deconstruct a bit the photo. And by the way, this is a photo I took in summer 2016 on one of the streets in the center of Bucharest. That's one of the neighborhoods that would be part of the broader center of Bucharest, which is also very close to the old town, the specific neighborhood that my book focuses on and uses as a window onto understanding and analyzing broader negotiations of power and social and political change from basically the end of the Second World War into 2016 when I finished my fieldwork in Bucharest. So let me actually start this by deconstructing this photo. One part of the photo is this staircase that's part of the 19th century mansion. That's very much kind of a neoclassic mansion built as part of the broader attempt for pursuing modernization via architecture in the second part of the 19th century Bucharest. And so this staircase is in fact a symbol for one of the key questions of the book. So what does the past mean at the distinct political moments? The other question informing the book, the research, is actually captured by this partial image of an apartment building that had been built in the 1970s, very likely, judging by the style, right next to this mansion. So basically was on the empty lot that was very much part of the broader land plot that would be part of the estate of this mansion. So it really captures many of the transformations going on at the time: nationalization of property, the very own attempt of the socialist regime to pursue their own modernization by trying to offer better living standards to a broader population by pursuing urbanization at a rapid pace. And so this apartment building is really kind of a quintessence of the socialist attempt to pursue modernization on their own terms. And then the Trabi, right? This is quite a find, right? You don't really experience this kind of walking on the street and then coming across this Trabi covered by ivy, left, abandoned in one of these courtyards on, one of these streets of Bucharest. So the Trabi is really a very special symbol. So it is very much a symbol of a specific alternative modernity. Remember that Trabi was very much pushed as an alternative to the Volkswagen. It became very much embraced by other socialist countries in the Soviet bloc, but it really became much more than that. It was politically speaking, it was a metaphor and a means to really signal this alternative modernity. But at the same time, it was a modernity that had its own hiccups, right? So people who would drive a Trabant at that time were they had to really cope with various ways in which the Trabi sometimes might not work. They would have to really find themselves stopping, forcefully stopped in the middle of the street and find a way to really basically work around the engine and make it again work. So there is actually this kind of socialist modernity is a kind of modernity with hiccups. Their own hiccups. I'm not saying that capitalist modernity doesn't have its own hiccups either, but it's a very special way of capturing this attempt to, first of all, on one hand, create a modern society according to the agenda and the terms of the socialist regimes at the time. But at the same time, it's also an attempt to really find a way to make this work despite the very specific limitations that would be an outcome of the increasingly centralized economy, and the various kinds of limitations of the ways in which the socialist system worked as a whole. Okay, so that's basically the cover of the book and the ways in which some of the themes of the book actually are reflected visually by the cover. The broader theoretical questions informing the book are several. So one of the key questions I'm trying to answer is which objects and aesthetic categories were invested with political meaning, by whom, and under what circumstances. Then, in the particular case of Romania, how did state officials during communism and after communism employ specific objects in order to promote and often redefine criteria of belonging to the body politics? And also, particularly in the case of many of the countries, not all, but many of the countries that became part of the Soviet bloc after at the end of the Second World War, how did these regimes that had been viewed with a mix of mistrust by the broader population, with a mix of mistrust, hope, on the behalf of some groups in the broader public. Right, so this kind of paradoxical mix of mistrust and hope, how are these states, how these regimes try to really gain legitimacy from the broader public and try to really claim, a certain kind of connection to the people, to their political subjects by creating their own history as new regimes. And then is the question of what does it mean for a place or an object or a site to move in and out of this category of heritage? And how is the connection, what is actually specifically the relationship between heritage making and state making? And in my case, the title, Socialist Heritage, actually has a double meaning. So on one hand, I am looking and analyzing processes whereby the socialist regime had been trying to create its own heritage, its own history, with an eye to gaining this broader political legitimacy from a rather relatively mistrustful population. I'm not sure if that's a word. The second meaning of the term is the very legacy of the socialist regime and its continuing influence on the society and politics in post-89 Romania. Okay, so the book, as I said, centers on the changes in the meaning, political significance, and also urban changes happening in this specific neighborhood, the old town of Bucharest. And on this map that actually tries to capture the broader center of Bucharest, this is a map that mirrors a map that became just very much used in 1968. It's a touristic map of Bucharest. And if you look at this first map, you see that the old town is very much in the center of Bucharest. Yeah. However, if you look at this other map, the second map in the corner, which was part of a touristic guide published in 1934, the description of the map right above the map mentions that this is the center of the capital with various kinds of institutions and the main streets. But however, the old town on the map published in 1934 is actually not right in the center. Yeah, it's relatively marginal. So it's fascinating to think of the change that occurred between 1934 and 1968 and why this change matters. So the neighborhood was relatively marginalized, was still viewed as part of the center of Bucharest at large, but not it was the very center of Bucharest. And so basically my research that's based on archival research, is going to answer the question why suddenly this transition, suddenly this shift. So what is the old town? The old town is a fascinating place for some of you who might have visited or might know the place very well. It's a highly heterogeneous combination of various kinds of architectural styles, of various kinds of people with very distinct social capital and economic capital. It has changed dramatically, and it kept being very much in the midst of this continuous change. So it is a place of contrast, a chameleonic place, as I call it in my book. It reflects and refracts broader visions of the city, of an ideal community, of an ideal body politic, but it also challenges at the same time. As I said, at different moments in time, this place comes to really have a very particular uncanny agency that not only through the people that inhabit this place, but also through these very buildings, through this very materiality of the place, and this very heterogeneity of this materiality. It really stands as a source of not necessarily resistance, right? Because that's too strong of a word, but definitely a source of challenge. And it really is a place that reveals visually, aesthetically, this continuous tension between what stands as a proper past, proper from the political perspective, and what stands as a rather strange, uncanny, improper past. So that's why I chose to put these two photos to juxtapose one to another, because here you see this kind of, much more French style, mixed type of architectural style that's very much characteristic of 19th century, end of the 19th century style of building, on a building that is relatively fine, right? Architecturally speaking, you can see new windows, new doors. It was also definitely an attempt to really preserve the specific architectural elements of the original construction. And you could see the distinction between the first photo and the second photo. The second photo that's actually really it's also almost, materially a palimpsest of time and history, right? You see the graffiti on it. You see that, in fact, it was a modernist building. You can see by the balcony and the style that is very likely a building that had been constructed in the 1920s, maybe 1930s, but definitely not later, that had been abandoned, and now you have a tree growing through this modernist balcony. So you can, it's a fascinating metaphor on how modernism actually became history in this case. So, and the broader argument and why I'm actually focusing on the old town is I'm using it as a window, as a window onto understanding long-term processes of social political change and the multiple lives of this neighborhood become a very poignant story in itself, but also a poignant story about broader transformation and also radical transformation in a context in a city and a country that had undergone radical transformations from the interwar period into the communist period, and then in the post-communist period, and then during the so-called new Europeanization following the official inclusion of Romania into the structures of the European Union in 2007. Just a bit of the book structure. It really, so the chapters follow chronologically. These patterns of change. It moves from understanding the attempt to transform Bucharest into a modern socialist city, the challenges that the architects and politicians in the 50s had to really deal with and eventually find a way to negotiate during the 60s, when they realized that they are increasing, they have specific limitations of expertise, of funds, to really build a thoroughly modern city out of this very heterogeneous historical city. And then moving into a discussion about how, in fact, a profession that was seemingly marginalized in terms of the regimes of expertise that were valued at the time come to really play a key role in maintaining the old town on the map and somehow saving it from destruction. I'm also talking about, in a chapter about the unsuccessful attempt to transform the old town into a so-called architectural reservation, representing an alleged Romanian national style in architecture. This didn't really go anywhere, but I'm actually looking at this project to be pursued in late 70s as a fascinating way to try to think about what kind of visions of the city were then welcomed, embraced, promoted, not only by architects, but also politicians, and why some of these visions of the city came not to really take place. The last two chapters are focusing on the impact of these transformations onto the post-communist phase period, when in fact the old town is a fascinating place, and I'm arguing that it becomes an interesting litmus test to see connections between the new elites, the so-called new elites, and the former communist elites, and the very important overlaps between the two, the ways in which these elites are trying to pursue a strategic devaluation of the old town, to not only push back any attempts for preserving the architecture of the old town, but also to push back any attempts for the old town to gain specific visibility and real estate value, economic value, precisely because they really wanted somehow to really portray it as if it's frozen in time, and to keep its value artificially lower, and let time, in fact, increase its value, and make it much more valuable as a potential real estate investment much later, basically a decade or so later. And I'm also looking at the ways in which many of these elites managed to find a way to control and even really gain property rights over some of the buildings and businesses of the old town. And then I'm moving into the last part of the research that ends with my fieldwork there in 2016, where I actually talked to people living in many of the decrepit buildings of the old town. Many of them are tenants that are basically renters living in the state-owned properties. But these properties, these buildings are so run down precisely because the local officials chose to let them, in fact, let them actually become increasingly decrepit as a way to make these tenants leave, and then this local administration be able to privatize these locations for relatively, very good money. Okay, so this is the structure of the book. I am just going to briefly talk a little bit about the broader context of Romania. So Romania came into being as an official independent state at the end of the Russo-Turkish War in 1878. It was actually officially acknowledged by the European powers then. And it really was a monarchy, politically speaking, a constitutional monarchy starting with 1920s. And precisely because it was a monarchy led by a German aristocratic line, this aristocratic family tried to really bring in an agenda of modernization that was to really mirror other attempts of modernization through urbanization that accompanied, that were more prevalent in the Western Europe at that time. After the First World War, Romania's territory becomes much larger. It gains Transylvania, Bukovina, and Bessarabia. Some of these regions stay within the geography of Romania at the end of the Second World War. Some others don't. But what actually the transformation of the state and this sudden geographic expansion meant that the population of Romanian citizens became increasingly, diverse. So 40% of the population living in interwar Romania were non-Romanian. They were not Romanians by ethnic background. So they included Hungarians, representing the largest non-Romanian ethnic group, then Germans, Roma, but also many Romanian Jews, Armenians, which triggered an increasingly official and overt xenophobic agenda. By late 1930s, this really became an overt anti-Semitic agenda. Cristina Bejan and Ștefan Ionescu wrote two wonderful recent books on the ways in which anti-Semitism came to be very much part and parcel of the politics of the Romanian state at the time, which culminated with the Romanian Holocaust, during which many of the Romanian Jews and Roma were actually sent to Transnistria, deported to Transnistria under the order of then the Chief of State, Marshal Ion Antonescu. So Romania during Antonescu's regime was an ally of Nazi Germany, but then in the 11th hour it changed sides and joined the Allies. The result was that they had a bit of negotiation leverage at the end of the Second World War, but not much. It became part of the broader Soviet bloc. What was particular about Romania then in the 50s and the 60s was that there was a constant, more subtle but constant attempt on the behalf of the Romanian communists to distance themselves from Moscow and from the influence of the Soviets. And what's fascinating is that in the case of looking at how this changes and negotiations about urban changes took place, you can start seeing, in fact, through the archival research, how Romanian experts allied the Romanian politicians in an attempt to really push back some of the advice and expertise offered by the Soviets. So in a way, I'm actually arguing that if you really look at negotiations about urban form, and urban change, you see an earlier attempt to create a distance between Romanian communists and Soviet and the Soviets by pushing for a certain kind of independence at the level of the decision made about urban changes and the experts that they chose to hire to pursue these urban changes. Okay. The context of the post-communist Romania is, unfortunately, I know this is not a quantitative type of analysis, but I'm using this index of corruption that's yearly produced by Transparency International to show that, in fact, not much has changed between 2007, when Romania became part of the EU and promised that they will really deal with corruption, and 2021, right? So the index signaling corruption in 2007 was very close to 45, the index signaling the level of corruption in 2021. So there is this continuous struggle with corruption. I will not really talk much about this today, but I do talk about this corruption in my book. And I look at the ways in which corruption comes to really inform this increasingly radical social polarization happening, especially in Bucharest and other cities, I would say, in Romania. But based on my research, I specifically talk about Bucharest, in which local authorities have been trying, especially starting with mid-2000, to really basically kick out the poor in Bucharest, to marginalize them, to push away the homeless, to push away the squatters, to push away the Roma, especially the poor Roma, precisely because they want to privatize the city, and to do that as a justification for the continuous so-called Europeanization and modernization of the city. So that's the story of the last chapter in the book. But today, what I would like to talk about, I'm going to skip this. So the sources that I focus on, that I use, a range of sources from various archives, mostly in Bucharest, but I also did some archival work in the UNESCO archives in Paris, especially focusing on some of the reactions to the demolition of the radical demolition of a significant part of the center of Bucharest in the 80s. So I'm also drawing on these sources, and I'm combining the information I gained from archives with information I gained from basically doing fieldwork in Bucharest for two separate periods, one during 2008-2009, and then in the summer of 2016, when I talked to a broad group of people, especially including architects, art historians, experts, urban planners, but also inhabitants of the old town. So the second part of my talk today is actually focusing on the case of Old Town during the 1950s and 1960s. And it tries to answer the question why eventually the Old Town managed to survive, materially speaking, while other neighborhoods in the 80s became part of this radical demolition agenda and the transformation of a significant part of the historic Bucharest into the so-called civic center that was very much an attempt of the leader of the state then, Nicolae Ceausescu, to really claim his own imprint onto the geography of the city. So to answer the question of what really happened in 1980s, we need to really go back a few decades. So and I will start with the context of the immediate period at the end of the war. So the urban structure of the city at the end of the war was rather problematic. Many bombardments led to even a lower capacity of the city to provide housing. And on one hand, the Communist Party, as I mentioned earlier, really tried to pursue this modernization, this rapid modernization. One of the sources of really grounding this modernization was to bring in significant labor from the countryside into the urban sites, right, to really spur the industrialization process. But this labor, right, these laborers, these new workers needed housing. And so they needed to really solve, the party needed, and the government needed to solve this post-war housing crisis. So initially, they had very high hopes. They thought, oh, we can just really transform the city into a thoroughly modern place, do away with the historic center, try to demolish the historical center and erect new, socialist architecture. And the leader of the state then, Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej, the de facto party secretary, said, quote, "The master plan to build a socialist city needs to be the dictator of construction in Bucharest. The city council has a kind and large heart, but this, no one should be allowed to squander state resources to waste energy." So what was happening at that moment was that people needed housing. And if this housing was not provided to them, they would start actually making up for that lack. So they would start building their own houses, even though this housing would not be authorized, right? It would really go against the very attempt to create a modern, thoroughly functional city. But people kept doing this because they needed a roof above their heads. And so this discussion happened during a long negotiation, a long Politburo meeting in November 1953, in which the then chief of architect of Bucharest, Macovei, tried to really try to really present the master plan for the new master plan for the city to the Politburo, right, to the political leadership. But he also said, well, we want to do this, but we also are aware that, first of all, we do not know how to really build skyscraper overnight. They didn't have the expertise to do that. And then he also made a very important point. It will take time to demolish the old city in order to really construct a new city on its right on the now newly freed ground. So if they had, so this was how they presented, right? They wanted to really create a thoroughly new city, and they were really viewing the old city as an eyesore. And this is a satellite map of the old town. And this, you can see how narrow and convoluted those streets are, and this kind of geography characterized much of the city at the time in 1950s. This kind of older historical city was very much a combination of various kinds of sites that really throughout the centuries, they evolved independently until they became part of the city. So it was by any means, Bucharest would be considered at that time a certain kind of unifocal city with a very specifically defined historical core. No, it was very much a much more multifocal set of dwellings that eventually really evolved into a city organically, across centuries. And this is exactly what the new political leadership totally abhorred. So one of the Politburo members said that this is a city that, I quote, evolved as a spider web of narrow and skewed streets. So they wanted to do away with the spider, the city-like spider, a spider-like city. But then they realized that it's very hard for them to do that. Eventually, what they decided to do is they will really keep this for the second phase of demolition and urban modernization. And they start by building in the margins. So this is what they did throughout 1950s and 1960s. But at this moment in time, the fate of the historical city had not really been decided. They were still so angry about the old aesthetics that would represent the old political order of the historical center of Bucharest, that they were still not persuaded that they should not demolish. And so there was a continuous negotiation between what to do. They started building new neighborhoods, new apartment building complexes in the margins of Bucharest, while still deciding what to do about the center of Bucharest. And there is a very interesting shift happening. So this is a postcard from 1960. As you see, most of the photos and the buildings in the postcard really capture, in fact, this attempt to modernize through architecture, right? So these are basically the socialist realist buildings that were built during the 50s. And it's really an attempt to capture visually the very political agenda of how communist officials viewed Bucharest. They really wanted Bucharest to be a socialist modern capital. But if you look a bit later, a decade later, these are postcards, and I know postcards are limited, but I think they really capture something, especially when this shift is very much grounded in information gathered from archives. You already start seeing an important shift. By now, it's a combination. So the ideal version of the city, it's a combination of old and new. So you see some of the newer buildings combined with modernist buildings from the interwar period. And some of them are also much older buildings, like for instance, in the second postcard, you see old historical buildings that would also be very much part of this idealized version of the city. And if you really look a bit more closely in the corner here, this is actually a photo of the old court from the late 70s, when it eventually became part of the it became an open-air museum. So what I'm going to talk about right now is going to be the story of the Old Court and how come this became important. So as I said, there were still negotiations going on about what to do about the center of Bucharest. There were several architectural competitions launched and sponsored evidently by the state during the mid and late 1950s. And these architectural competitions especially focus on the modernization or the attempt to modernize the main squares, the main points, piazzas, basically in the geography of the center of the city. And one of them is actually the Union Square. This is the drawing that won the first prize during the 1969 competition about the redesign of Union Square. So you remember the old town, how it looked like, right, in the satellite map. This was an attempt to really thoroughly modernize the center with this kind of obviously modern buildings. On this map, the old town was supposed to be somewhere here. So as you see, they would not really do away with the entire old town, but they would somehow hide it behind these new skyscrapers. But what happened is that this project of remodeling Union Square could not happen. In fact, it took another generation and another 20 years for this to really take shape in a different form, that is the Civic Center under Ceausescu's leadership. And why it didn't happen then? Well, it did not happen because of this story that is less known. It's because of a bunch of archaeologists who started digging in, doing excavations in the center of Bucharest. They came across the ruins of the former palace of the Old Court. And they became increasingly anxious and about the imminent demolition of a part of the old town, and implicitly the erasure of what they viewed as historical monuments of national importance. And because they were still small, in the sense of they were politically not so valuable, right? It was a bunch of architects related from the city of Bucharest. They didn't have the leverage. They didn't have the political capital that architects would have at that time. They decided to not contact the architects directly, but to contact basically political leaders in the system, in the institutional system of the party. So, and this is this is the very beginning of a long exchange of letters happening starting with 62 up to basically early 70s. In which archaeologists and architects would start exchanging some letters that were pretty, strong, using very strong words for the kind of genre of the letters that were expected at that time, right? Institutional letters. They were really, the architects would actually really criticize the archaeologists would criticize the architects for not knowing and denying the history of the old town. Architects would say archaeologists don't know what they are doing, precisely because we are not interested in the past anymore. We are not interested in some ruins. We really want a new socialist city, and so on and so forth. This kind of correspondence is in a very thick set of files in the archives of the National Institute of Patrimony in Bucharest. And it's quite a fascinating conversation about what does it mean, what is valuable then, to what extent some buildings are valuable and to what extent some ruins could suddenly be valuable when political priorities change. And what's particular about the story of the Old Court, this is a map of the archaeological digs conducted on the territory of the broader old town between 53 and 59. So it's exactly the period that overlaps with the architect's attempts to modernize the area. here are the circle, the double circles are located on the area where these ruins of the former medieval palace that would be then named as the Old Court were located. And what was particular about this is that those ruins were in fact underground. So these ruins did not exist, were just a potential site of historical importance. That the architects had knowledge, right, abstract knowledge about the ruins, but they had to really have enough support to be able to not only have funding to dig more, but also to make those ruins matter politically to the socialist regime at the time. So how did they do that? Well, it's a much longer story, and I'm actually really not going to really tell much of that story. I'd be happy to elaborate in the Q&A. But one of the arguments of this analysis is that suddenly those ruins were not important for the architects. To a certain extent, they didn't really matter to the socialist regime in the 1950s. But they became to matter when nationalists started to matter again for the socialist regime. So, and what happened was that it became the transformation of these forgotten, abandoned ruins underground into what would become an open-air museum and deemed as a site of national historic importance across a few decades, was very much connected and informed by the strategic attempt of the socialist state to pursue a nationalist agenda. And by actually insisting on the value of the Old Court for the Romanian history, they found a way to minimize and eventually erase the much more, vibrant, vivid, multi-ethnic history of conviviality, that represented the Old Town up to 1945. This was a place where many people of various kinds of ethnic groups would actually find a way to establish a business, to forge neighbor relations, to really thrive. And if you actually look at, this is just an excerpt from a phone book from 1937. If you really look and the streets are underlined in red, but if you look at the names appearing on these streets, all of the streets underlined in red were actually in the Old Town. You see, in fact, that this was a highly heterogeneous, ethnically heterogeneous place where many, many Romanian Jews and many people of Jewish background lived. So my argument is that by focusing so much on the Old Court and associating the Old Town to the Old Court, the socialist regime tried very hard, and to a certain extent it did succeed in erasing this multi-ethnic history of the Old Town, the richness of the Jewish presence in the culture and geography of Bucharest across centuries. And so it really became a way to silence particular histories and promote others. And the Old Court became the material tool through which this erasure of history, of histories that did not fit the nationalist agenda of the socialist regime, happened. This is a photo that became part, so the Old Court came to, in fact, be very much promoted as a museum through postcards, lots of touristic guides about Bucharest. So the Old Court became a place to visit for Bucharest and tourists alike. And I'm going to stop here for the sake of time. The book continues into talking about the Old Town and what happened with the Old Town from the perspective of the officials in the 80s. But I will be happy to address that during the Q&A. So this is a photo from the Old Town in the 80s. And I'm going to stop sharing now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I think we owe you a big round of applause. as this was a very, very fascinating, extraordinary kind of tour through history. I personally enjoyed very much the images, the maps, but as a political scientist, I think the food for thought that you have provided about those turf battles, and we've been writing in the chat trying to distract you, possibly while you're presenting, because you've touched on so many things that are important to us, such as state captures, such as identity, reminded us that archaeology is actually, or architecture rather, is an expression of power relationships, and this rediscovery of antiquity that is not important, but then becomes important. Then it's been showcased. It's something truly fantastic, and it offers a lot of food for thought. Not only as a showcase for Romania, but I think a greater, I was just thinking constantly about my native Sofia and how many of those processes actually are very similar to what I have seen in the old town of Sofia and the battles of the post-socialist elites. Hence, probably my first question before we open the floor, if Mary doesn't object, would be, how did state capture affect the old town? Because I know that, for instance, the old town of Sofia was a very much contested space in terms of privatization, of ownership, of its architectural facade. And I would be very interested, some comments on that, and then pass to Mary, for those questions, and pass the floor to so many questions from anywhere I see, from Skopje to to elsewhere. So thank you, Emma.
Oh, thank you so much. So just to make sure I understood your question, Kirill, you are asking what time are you thinking about when you ask when did the state come to capture the old town in Bucharest?
No, I was meaning comments beyond what you covered in post-revolutionary times, and because you were showing Transparency's corruption measure and state capture as an expression of corruption. How did corruption affect the face of the old town? This is where I was getting to.
I see.
The rest of it you showed us very detailed.
Do you want me to answer now?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So this, so I deal with this in the second part of the book. What happens is that the old town in the 90s, so during the 90s up to basically 1997, I'm actually discussing how, in fact, a group of architects teamed up with a team of British architects who contributed to the renovation, the revitalization of Covent Garden in London. And this team of architects came to visit Bucharest at the invitation of Bucharest architects to see to what extent they can actually remake something in the old town. And the fascinating thing is, based on my conversation with architect Nick Falk, who was the leader of the British team, was that they met with lots of politicians at that time. And the politicians said, oh, this town doesn't really matter. This kind of attempts to renovate, to rehabilitate the neighborhood will actually have no value, because eventually the waters of the river Dâmbovița passing by would eventually really undermine the whole foundation of these houses, and your attempts to renovate these houses will really, be moot. So, and then there were other attempts to renovate that really, they didn't lead to anything. Eventually, the British team realized that this is not going to really happen. And I'm arguing that, in fact, this was very much part and parcel of the local officials' strategy to keep the old town undervalued for a long time. So the time when indeed there were specific funds brought into the old town, and there was this attempt to so-called Europeanize the old town by changing the infrastructure, changing the streets, transforming the streets into these cobblestone streets meant to really signify history, is very much something happening starting with mid-2000s. And it's with funds from the European Union that precedes and continues after the Romania's inclusion into the European Union. So yeah, it's a much longer story, but it's definitely very much, you know, a representation of how corruption worked through undervaluing specific places, while also very important to keep in mind, many of these new elites were trying very much to actually capture businesses and buildings whose ownership was still vague at that moment.
Yeah, classical sort of grab and battle for the heart of the city. Thank you, Emma, for addressing this, and it's really fascinating. Miri?
Sorry, I was muted. John, I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name, but Sitechka? Go ahead and ask your question. Sorry about
Great.
that.
No problem. Thank you. It's close enough. Thanks so much for the presentation. I have a question. I was so struck by your analogy with a spider web from the document. I think it was from the 1950s. And I couldn't help but kind of understand Bucharest in that moment as something caught up in this kind of social web of things that needed to be cleaned out. It was a corner of a place that needed to be perhaps cobbled up together and removed, right? Dust that needed to be getting rid of. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about that, if in the documents you see the politicians looking at it this way, as this old town being something, you know, old that's been caught up in whatever they wanted it to be, but these new, you know, these new aspirations for what Bucharest could be were part of this web that they wanted to erase away. And I thought that analogy was so interesting and so poignant. So I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for raising this question, John. And it's very nice to meet you. We've been exchanging messages through Twitter. Thank you for your presence here. So what's really interesting about that is that indeed, there was a clear attempt on the behalf of the socialist leadership to portray themselves as the first regime to modernize the city. But in fact, that was not true. So there were attempts of the local administration during the late 20s, especially early 30s in Bucharest, to modernize the city, and some of them were successful, some others were not. They focused specifically on places in Bucharest, like enlarging, for instance, the boulevards, building new streets, especially enlarging the streets. So, but the socialist leadership did not want to really acknowledge these early attempts at modernization, because they wanted to really make a clear distinction between who they are and the former political order, right? The bourgeoisie, who basically allegedly didn't really care about the city and the poor inhabitants and so on. So, and what's fascinating is that there was an attempt on the behalf of a team of architects to create a master plan for the city, and it was published in 1934. But precisely because of lots of corruption happening then too, there were not enough funds, and there were lots of mayors coming and going. So there was no such an attempt of the local administration to be stable enough politically in order to invest in really pursuing the master plan of 1934. However, what's fascinating is that the socialist leadership eventually decided to bring back some of the architects who were connected to the 1944 master plan, on the condition that they, and I talk about this in the book, they issue their former bourgeois values. So basically there is another Politburo member who says, well, we appreciate him as an architect, but he was just a bourgeois landowner. As long as he doesn't have land, we like him as an architect. We want him here, right? So it really speaks to also the ways in which they really try to find a compromise between, on one hand, trying to claim that they represent a new political order, and realizing that they didn't have the experts that would actually be brought in to construct the new political urban, literally so. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question and wonderful answer. I wanted to turn to a question in the chat first, and then we can go to you, Keith Wagner. But so she said, I wonder, this is Natalia Alexion, I wonder if religious communities and sites of worship played in any way into plans of modernization and their aftermath. And then she says, I remember visiting a synagogue sort of hidden behind the modern blocks. And also, thank you for the great talk.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Natalia. It's very nice to see you here. There was in the archives I worked with, and as I said, I am aware that perhaps my archival collection was relatively limited. Maybe I could have found more in different archives. There was no talk whatsoever about religious sites. So, and the question of the religious sites, especially the non-Christian religious sites, especially the synagogues that were so prevalent, especially in this area of the old town, which, by the way, during the interwar came to be known as the so-called Jewish quarter. They lasted because they were saved by the very fact that this historic place was saved as a site, as a brother site. There was no attempt to salvage the synagogues. There was an attempt, though, to salvage some of the Christian sites, that is the Orthodox churches also occupying in the area. And what happened really is that the architects at that moment developed a very interesting system of basically putting specific train rails under the churches and literally moving some of these churches a few, 10 meters or even 100 meters farther, so it would not, they would still be preserved, but they would be hidden, really, literally, during the construction of the civic center behind a very tall 20 floor buildings that were very much, abutting the large boulevards of the civic center. But there was no attempt to salvage the synagogues. The synagogues lasted. The synagogues that were still, standing, precisely because they did not have the time nor the resources to demolish the buildings surrounding them.
Thank you so much for that. Keith Wagner, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Grama, for this talk. It was really fascinating. I wish I had seen your book before I did my presentation in the fall in Bucharest. It's super interesting, all of this, what you talk about with the category of heritage and how to make things value and matter. So I was really interested when you talk about the new Europeanization, and this is a little bit after 2016, but if you're still monitoring the political administration in Bucharest with Clotilde Armand and working with Nicu Șordan and sort of these new nods at Europeanization and cleaning up the image. I wonder if you see any connection between that and what you talked about in the socialist period and in general privatization and pushing poor people out, and whether that the whole metaphor of, I know Clotilde Armand had this whole campaign of cleaning up trash, whether that was is that metaphorical for cleaning up the people that live in central Bucharest, and sort of are there any connections with the current mayor and that political regime and what you talked about?
Yeah, thank you so much, Keith. I think this is very important because it really shows the continuities. So first of all, for those of you who are less familiar with the contemporary politics in Romania, especially in Bucharest, Clotilde Armand is the mayor of so Bucharest has 5 regions, arrondissement in French. I don't really know exactly the translation in English, right? So Clotilde Armand is actually managed to really gain to be elected as the mayor of the first arrondissement. The very important thing is, why don't I share the screen for a second, because I want to actually talk about the maps, and then I'm going to I want to really kind of show you on the map where this maybe I'm just like going too fast, but I'm sorry about this. I wanted to speak on the map. Okay, so here is the old town. The first arrondissement is here. And this is where Clotilde Armand, right, has control over the local administration here. But this is a neighborhood that was built during the 50s and the 60s. Some fascinating buildings were meant for the socialist leadership. So this is really the poshest and the most valuable and valued in terms of real estate location in Bucharest. Nicu Jordan, that Keith also mentioned, is the current mayor of Bucharest as a whole. What's very interesting about Nicu Jordan is that he came to politics through his involvement in the attempt to save some of the historical buildings in Bucharest. So he actually used this connection between protection of historical heritage, built heritage, and political opposition. And I do remember actually long time ago when I was in Bucharest in 2009, meeting him, and he was then the leader of this group, which I forgot the name of the group, but it was definitely, Save Bucharest, Salvați Bucureștiul, right? So this was an NGO that formed around the very particular agenda of saving, bringing more visibility to these historic buildings of Bucharest in an attempt to show that these buildings are that indeed valuable economically and historically, and also to challenge their attempt to challenge exactly what Kirill asked about. What happened with the political elites who insisted that these buildings have no value, and therefore they should be demolished and the land underneath should be used for new buildings. I will stop sharing now, but so that's fascinating to think of how political negotiations and political opposition is defined, had been defined for a while, but the extent to which a political faction viewed built heritage as valuable, and versus a different political faction that tried to really minimize the value of built heritage in Bucharest and kind of use Bucharest as a kind of tabula rasa, right? To sell the land to various kinds of international real estate developers. But that's a different book.
I'm just trying to see if there's any other hands up. If not, I have a question. I've thought a lot about the history of cities across our region, and I even taught a course on it at one point. I was just fascinated by the transformation of cities in various parts of Eastern Europe over time, and particularly their transformation eventually from being these kind of rich multi-ethnic spaces, which in some ways were perceived as foreign by kind of new national elites, and transformation then into kind of nationalized, more sort of towards uninational cities, which seems like a little bit of essentially the pattern here eventually. But one of the things that interested me was in that process of thinking not just about sort of people who get expelled or leave in various periods of time from the region, but thinking about the architecture. What I saw was that, and this is like, I just want to kind of see how this plays out in Bucharest, but in many areas, it was easy to take existing architecture and sort of recode it as national. So in Prague, you could recode architecture built by Germans and Jews as Czech. In Croatia, you can call the Italian architecture on the coast Croatian. So there's a lot of this sort of Europe, sort of maybe generically European or not so generically European architecture that can be sort of easily appropriated. But in the Ottoman areas, the areas that were under Ottoman rule for a longer time, more architecture had to be knocked down because it was seen as Oriental. It wasn't the kind of face that people wanted to put forward. And so in Sofia, for example, late 19th century, just knocked down like most of the Ottoman architecture in Sofia to build a new kind of European city at that time. And so I'm kind of wondering in this period, because it's a little bit later than in the earlier periods, I think people were a little more blatant about, what they want, sort of coding certain kinds of architectures as Oriental, or even using anti-Semitic language to talk about knocking down Jewish towns or Jewish parts of quarters. I'm just kind of wondering if any of that language comes in the communist period, because certainly it was continuing in Bulgaria in that period. Europeanization was also kind of a de-orientalization of, spaces, of people, of sort of public presence. So was there any of that kind of language still in play in this period? And what were the Romanians able to kind of appropriate as Romanian that may have not actually been all that Romanian?
So I want to show you something.
Long question, sorry.
It's okay, it's totally fine, because you basically, that's exactly answers the, do you see this photo, this drawing? Okay. This is actually the focus of chapter 3 of the book, with time traveling houses. And why is it time traveling houses? Is that this architect with a very interesting political trajectory. He actually was working as an architect of the Iron Guard during 1930s. And he had a very strong idea about how to really redecorate and renovate and, not renovate, rehabilitate the old town before the communist regime. So he actually is shunned politically, he's marginalized, he's been sent to prison, but then he is actually able to come back professionally. And in the early 60s, in the late 60s, he is the one who comes to really try to pursue this renovation according to a so-called national Romanian architectural style of the old town. The project doesn't really happen, so it's one of these unsuccessful projects. But what's fascinating about it is that it almost happened. So he had enough support from the local administration for getting funds to redesign some of the buildings of the old town to an extent that they will look a bit more like Romanian architecture. And what his justification was that, so this are, as you see, this is actually a closed balcony. So he said that these closed balconies are very much a transposition into an urban space of a more Romanian vernacular architecture that was very much part of the style of building of 18th century. So there are very interesting things happening here. First of all, he wants to do away and minimize and whitewash almost, right? The urban modernization of Bucharest happening in 19th century. And if you remember that French style 19th century building from the earlier presentation on Old Town, there were lots of buildings like that appearing in the Old Town as very much part of the broader architectural modernization of Bucharest in the late 19th century. And he says, no, this is not real Romanian, right? This is kind of Western influences. This is real Romanian. But what's really interesting about it is that if you really look at this kind of style of the closed balcony, is that it's an element, an architectural intervention that appears not only in Romania, but in many places of the former Ottoman Empire. So, so he actually claims that this is Romanian because he wants to really be the one leading this project. He also wants to a certain extent gain some political visibility, but he's also genuinely believing that this is the Romanian style of architecture that should prevail in the Old Town, especially in the conditions in which the Old Town is now claimed to be the representation of historic of the past of Bucharest, of the historic center of Bucharest. I'm going to stop sharing now, but yeah. So I talk a lot about that, right? And it's exactly another phenomenon that that echoes what you're mentioning, right? Some specific styles are recoded as allegedly national, where they're not national at all.
Yeah, and I was going to say in the Bulgarian case too, certain Ottoman architecture, like the 19th century houses, the kind of cantilevered homes, were considered revival style Bulgarian architecture, still are, in, for example, Old City of Plovdiv. So There was certain Ottoman architecture that was okay, but most of it was not.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah. So let's see, do we have any other questions or comments from our audience? I realize time is coming to a close, so people are kind of heading off to take care of floods like Raul did, or
Oh, God.
what? He said there's a flood, I don't know, or whatever
Yeah.
other things. Well, this is so exciting. I ordered my book on Amazon right before this, and I'm so excited to just read it cover to cover, because I think it's such an interesting lens to understand Romanian history or our regional history through the history of the city, and particularly through that one part of the city and all those intertwined issues. So, and thank you so much for bringing your uniquely interdisciplinary approach to this.
Oh, yes, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me here, as part of the series. And I greatly appreciate everyone's presence and time and wonderful questions. It was a lot of fun to talk about my work. So thank you again.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you everyone for coming.